Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're here to talk about three fundamental questions. What is language death? Why this expression is problematic? And what are the alternatives? Stay tuned. So first of all, what is language death? Language death is just a process by which a language stops being spoken. Now, there are two main types of so-called language death. In the first case, all of its original speakers died without leaving any offspring. A clear example of this are the Tasmanian languages in Australia. For instance, as you can see on the screen, Fanny Cochrane Smith is widely believed to have been the last speaker of any Tasmanian Aboriginal languages. And with his death in 1905, all Tasmanian languages came to an end. In the second case, a language dies because a new language is adopted instead. And in this case, there is both language death and a language shift. So as you can see on the screen, a case in point is to be found in Etruscan. Now, Etruscan was the linguistic variety adopted by a civilization of ancient Italy that came to adopt Latin somewhere between the 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD. Now, in contrast with these two cases, and against what most people think, ancient languages such as Latin or Sanskrit are not dead languages. Rather, they were transformed into regional varieties that, due to historical and socio-cultural reasons, eventually came to be recognized as independent languages. Think, for instance, of French in the case of Latin, or Hindi in the case of Sanskrit. Number two, why is the expression language death problematic? Well, it's because it prevents us from realizing the extent to which the reason why these languages are no longer spoken is that its population of speakers was systematically marginalized, conquered, and or exterminated. So the very label language death makes it look as though the extinction of a language is a natural process, devoid of any political or otherwise violent causes, which is exactly the opposite of reality. Therefore, rather than helping us understand the process by which a language came to an end, it diverts our attention from that central circumstance. That's why every time we use and reproduce the labels language death and dead language, what we're actually doing is being complicit, either knowingly or inadvertently, in reproducing the colonial linguistic ideology that helps naturalize and depoliticize the history of languages as written by the victors and in their language. And this is not some abstract conception. Rather, this modern linguistic ideology of colonialism is present in our everyday practices, and you can find it pretty much everywhere, including instances of what look like innocent and even beautiful places. For instance, have a look at this image on the screen that you can see on the right side. This looks like a very innocuous depiction of the history of languages and their relationships. However, what is problematic with this picture, taking into account what I just explained? Exactly. Is the fact that it reproduces and uses a biological metaphor that makes it look as though languages transform each other in their next stage via a natural process. And in doing so, it obscures, it neglects, it erases a whole political and violent process that is pivotal to that language transformation, thus helping naturalize the end result of that journey. So what can we do about it? Well, we need to understand that figures of speech like language death or dead language are linguistic metaphors, and as such, they are part of what cognitive scientist George Lakoff has called framing, which is in turn a cognitive process. So as you can see here on the screen, in this book by Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate, Lakoff defines frames as mental structures that shape the way we see the world. As a result, they shape the goals we seek, the plans we make, the way we act, and what counts as a good or bad outcome of our actions. In politics, our frames shape our social policies and the institutions we form to carry out policies. To change our frames is to change all of these. Reframing is social change. Now, you can't see or hear frames. They are part of what we cognitive scientists call the cognitive unconscious, structures in our brains that we cannot consciously access, but know by the consequences. What we call common sense is made up of unconscious, automatic, effortless inferences that follow from our unconscious frames. We also know frames through language. All words are defined relative to conceptual frames. When you hear a word, its frame is activated in your brain. Yes, in your brain. As the title of this book shows, even when you negate a frame, you activate the frame. If I tell you, don't think of an elephant, you'll think of an elephant. So it's not enough to say, don't use language death or dead languages. We need to provide a counterframe, one that highlights precisely those aspects that are neglected and obscured in language dead and dead languages. And what are those? Well, there are at least two main counterframes, which are glottophagy and linguicide. As you can see on the screen, the first one, glottophagy, was first coined by Louis-Jean Calvet in his book Linguistique et colonialisme, petit traité de glottophagie, published in 1974. And it really comes down to glottos, or language, and phagia, or eating, devouring. So it really means linguistic cannibalism that a major colonial language performs on a minoritized language, therefore contributing to the disappearance of the latter. But unlike language death and dead languages, this counterframe glottophagy places the accent exactly on the political violence that underpins this process of language disappearance. And the second counterframe is linguicide. As you can see on the screen, it was coined by Skobnab and Philipson in 1995, and it really comes down to language and then side, which means killing. So linguicide, as the authors say, serves to clarify the ideologies, structures, and processes involved in linguistic inequality and their results. This requires distinctions between the fate of languages versus the fate of their speakers, the fate of individuals versus the fate of groups, ideologies, structures, and processes versus results. Linguicide is the extermination of languages, an analogous concept to physical genocide. And this is in contrast with language death, which, as we already said, is the withering away of languages, an analogous concept to natural death. So equipped with these two counterframes, glottophagy and linguicide, we can now revisit a couple of languages we spoke about and arrive at an enlightened understanding of their disappearance. And so, first of all, there was nothing natural about the disappearance of Tasmanian languages. Rather, the language death of the Tasmanian Aboriginal languages turns out to be a linguicide, turns out to be the result of the extermination of the Tasmanian community by the European settlers in Australia, beginning with their arrival in the 19th century. That is the reason why all Tasmanian Aboriginal languages disappeared, because their community of speakers was systematically exterminated by European colonizers. By the same token, Etruscan didn't disappear just like that either. Rather, it ceased to exist as a result of the Roman-Etruscan Wars, the last battle of which was the conquest by the Roman Empire of the Etruscan League city Veii in 396 BC. So as a result, what we saw is a process of glottophagy, whereby Latin superseded Etruscan. So I hope I have cleared up why the expressions language death and dead language are problematic, what are the alternative counterframes such as glottophagy and linguicide, and as always, thanks for watching.